Thank you, and welcome to the Danish School of Education. Welcome to this lecture by Professor Martin Seligman, and above all, welcome to you, Professor Martin Seligman. It is indeed an honor to have you here today. My name is Claus Holm. I am the head of the Danish School of Education. And as you can understand, I am very pleased that Professor Martin Seligman is able to be here today and give us a lecture where, as I have understood it, you will present us for the state of the art of positive psychology today, and not least give us a description of the main challenges that positive psychology faces today. As a lot of you in the audience probably already know, Martin Seligman is the founding father of positive psychology and has written famous books as The Optimistic Child, Learned Optimism, and Authentic Happiness, to name a few. Books which have had a huge impact also in relation to the Danish pedagogical discussions on, for example, how you should bring up Danish children and pupils. And here at DPU, I think that positive psychology's contribution, for example, to the question of character strength and the concept of strength-enhancing children is meeting quite some interest as part of a new theoretical and practical focus on a life skill pedagogy, or as it is named in Danish, en livsduelighedspædagogik, that is often called in Danish. We know from educational science that you can improve a children's strengths by exposing them to high, challenging, and appropriate expectations. In a sense, we have known this since Charles Dickens wrote his novel Great Expectations. But with positive psychology, we have begun to talk about expectations again, and we have begun to talk about them not only as high, challenging, and appropriate expectations, but today we also talk about having optimistic expectations. Of course, the question is, how do you handle optimistic expectations, and does it work for all kinds of children? For example, also children with social and educational problems. These are some of the questions that I, DPU, and educational research as such is interested in. These are questions which we talk and discuss with positive psychology, and this is also why I'm so pleased that you are here today. I have, as you can probably hear, optimistic expectations related to your lecture here today. So one more time, welcome to Martin Seligman, and welcome to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Claus, for your kind words and for supporting positive psychology here. And welcome to Martin Seligman, who it is my great privilege to introduce now. When you said some month ago, or asked whether we could do something now that you were in Copenhagen, I didn't hesitate long. I was quite convinced that we could do something, not quite knowing what it would be, but something we could be. And the main reason for that conviction on my behalf was that we have a master program here at Aarhus University that is, of course, highly inspired by the positive psychology movement called Master of Positive Psychology that we have had for 5 years, and that for 6 years now, and where we have, for 6 consecutive years, have had the good fortune of having almost full campuses in both Aarhus and here. And this program was the first internationally accredited program on positive psychology in Denmark, and so far the only one also. And it was made possible through the goodwill of the university and a particular team of people who met for a long time to create it. And I would like those people just to stand up so that you can see them. It is Lector I Braun. It is special consultant Nina Tange. It is Lector Anne Kirketerp. It is Frans Ørsted Andersen, who is not present, and I would like our two PhD students, our two first PhD students within the positive psychology field, to stand up also. Mette Marie Ledertov, who just defended her thesis, and Louise Tidman. Will you please rise just to say that we are going. By now, on my count, we have enrolled around 400 students in the program, and many of you are here, I know. So if I may bother you just to stand up, if you in any way are willing to reveal your connection to positive psychology and the master program, please rise up and look around in the room. Wow. Give them a hand. Turning to you, Marty, it's really an honor and a great privilege to have you here. And I met you the first time, I think 12 years ago in Italy, in Verbania, at a conference in the European Network of Positive Psychology, where you had just published the character strength and virtues classification together with Chris Peterson, and you were speaking about that. Today, it's a classification of the human strength that is known all over the world, hugely influential, still work in progress, but a much needed supplement to the focus on the deficits of human beings that we have been so enrolled in for so long. You are arguably one of the most important psychologists living today. You are, without any doubt, one of the best known, and for many years you have shaped the field of psychology by very important contributions. Maybe the first that really became prominent was the discovery of the learned helplessness mechanism back in the 60s and 70s already. Then your work on learned optimism has had a big influence also. The formation, of course, of positive psychology together with Mike Csikszentmihalyi and Chris Peterson and Ray Fowler and other important figures had put its mark on where we are today, and then works like the character strength and virtues, your theories of authentic happiness and on flourishing and so on is well known throughout the world. And our students here have certainly been taught in those texts and also been taught to handle them with appropriate maturity. And I say the last point is about positive psychology in our culture being not only about what we want, but apparently also about what many people do not want, because positive psychology comes across as negative in some ways, especially when it's being misused or when people think that they are becoming shut up by having to smile when they're really angry and so on. I'm sure you'll talk a bit about that also today. But positive psychology has become a major topic to discuss, and I think everybody shares an interest in understanding what we can do to improve our well-being in the world. And nobody is better equipped to help us in that endeavor than you, Marty, so it's my great honor to invite you to the stage now. Please give Martin Seligman a warm welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be back in Denmark. Particularly joyful for me to speak in the country that seems to have the highest well-being in the world. and I'll address that mystery during this talk. But I'm going to give a half of a political speech today. And this will be something that none of you will have heard before. Let me frame the politics of this for you. Freud and Schopenhauer told us that the best we could ever do in life was not to be miserable. So the mark of a good government, good science, good psychology was to hold your suffering as close to zero as possible. Now, I want to suggest to you today that that's empirically false, that it's worse, it's morally insidious, and most importantly, I'm going to suggest to you it's a political dead end. So much of Western politics has been revolved around the question of misery. In some ways, it's absorbed the Freud-Schopenhauer view. And I'm all for the reduction of misery. I spent most of my life working on helplessness, hopelessness, depression, suicide, and the like. But the best you can ever do. Are there any journalists here, by the way? I'm going to. Good. Yes. For the most part, some journalists, not Catherine, have said that the job of journalism is to uncover what is hidden. But the best you can ever do with that kind of journalism is to get to zero. And the question is, what is the vision above zero? Our nations, Denmark and the West, in many ways in the last several decades, have been run by economists. And the notion of what a good nation does is to increase GDP and to decrease unemployment. I think we've come to a point in the world in which there is more to the human condition than just getting wealthy and not being unemployed. And so the theme of what I'm going to do today is to suggest this is neither a left nor right political doctrine. So the left-right, as I understand it, is who should do it, where the right says it should be done privately or by corporations. The left says the government should do it. Well, it's the it that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to suggest to you that it is no longer a sound aim. Wealth in and of itself, military conquest in and of itself, are no longer the end, no longer it. I'm going to suggest to you that well-being is the end that politics should run about. And if I had said this to you 30 years ago, you should not have paid attention. And that's because well-being, am I standing in the wrong place? Oh, oh my, okay. I'm more comfortable down there. 30 years ago, well-being was not measurable, and even worse, it was not buildable. So I was often asked when I worked on helplessness and depression and the like, why didn't I work on happiness? And there was actually one study that deterred me from working on happiness. So Phil Brickman in the 1970s followed, I think, 14 lottery winners, people who won $1 million or more in the Illinois State Lottery. And what Phil found was that for the next 3 months, if you look at happiness, life satisfaction, they got happier. But after 3 months, they went back down to their usual curmudgeonly baseline. And so I and a lot of other people thought, well, happiness, well-being is just the froth on the cappuccino, and the espresso is misery. And that was what was real. And so that actually kept me from working on it. So I thought happiness, well-being couldn't be built, that we could boost it for a bit, and then 3 months later you'd go back where you were. So things have changed now, 30 years later. So I'm going to suggest to you that well-being is measurable, and I'm going to give you a theory of well-being. So 30 years ago, there was no theory. We had theories of misery, but we had no theory of what well-being consisted in. Didn't have a theory. We didn't have measures. And worse, all of our interventions were about reducing misery. Both our drugs and our psychotherapies were about going from -8 to -3 in life. So we didn't have ways of building it. So I want to do 3 things today. I want to suggest a framework for looking at well-being. Then I want to suggest a measurement of well-being. And most importantly about measurement, as in public policy and in interventions, we work on building what we measure. And so it's an extremely important move to begin to measure well-being. And then I'll talk about the building of well-being. So I'm going to suggest to you that you can actually be happier than you are now, that Brickman was wrong, that you can have more, and I'll define it in a moment, PERMA than now in your future than you did now. So that's the framework, the political framework of my talk. I'm going to suggest to you that the political future in wealthy nations resides partly in the measurement of building of well-being, and the measure of good government, the measure of good public policy is the increase in the well-being of human beings. So that's half the political framework. So let me outline what I'm going to do over the next hour or so. So I have to begin by saying, what is well-being? So I'm going to suggest to you that there are 5 elements of well-being. And by an element, I mean element, I think, in almost literal sense, that these are the things that free, non-suffering people pursue in and of themselves, even if it brings none of the others. And it's just a work in progress, but I'm going to suggest to you there are 5 things that free, non-suffering human beings pursue. The first is P, positive emotion, subjective well-being, happiness. And some people often confuse positive psychology with the smiley face and work on happiness. And I'm not a great enthusiast about happiness for a couple of reasons. One is that it's highly heritable. So of all the elements I'm going to talk about, this is the one that is most, when you do identical versus fraternal twin studies, is at least 50% heritable. You can't change curmudgeons into cheerleaders. The best you can do with smiliness and being merry and subjective well-being is, I think you can learn to live in the upper part of a biologically set range, very similar to weight in that way, that you can learn to live at a healthy weight, but you can't take obese people and make them scarecrows. So highly heritable, not terrifically changeable, and therefore undemocratic in some ways. So I'm going to suggest that if you want to know about public policy succeeding, you want to measure PERMA. But it's very interesting that introverted people, you would count extroverted people a lot more. So extroverted people are more labile about positive emotion, and so you would essentially double count extroverted people. Those are 3 of about 10 reasons why I'm not terrifically enthusiastic about happiness as in an end in and of itself. But that's the first element, P, having more positive emotion. The second element is E, engagement, being in flow, being one with the music, being completely present. And looking around at you, it looks to me that about 80% of you are one with the music right now. The other 20% of you are having sexual fantasies, as it turns out. But the second element is flow, being engaged, what Mike Cheek sent me high deals with. The third thing that free, non-suffering people pursue for its own sake is good relationships, even if it doesn't bring P or E. And just to calibrate why I think that's important, one of the controversies in biology that I think is very important is group versus individual selection. So people like Dawkins have argued that we're the selfish gene, we're essentially individuals trying to get our genes out into the next generation. Whereas people like Ed Wilson and David Sloan Wilson have argued that human primate, we've been selected by groups. There's been group selection. And I'm very much on the group selection part of this argument, that I think in addition to individual selection, we're very similar to termites and bees and wasps. We're hive creatures, and that relationships are extremely important to the species. That's the third thing. And unrelated to the fourth thing that free people pursue, we ineluctably pursue meaning and purpose, M. We want to be part of something larger. We want to belong to and serve something larger than we are. So M is the fourth element, and A is achievement, accomplishment, mastery, and competence. So that's the theory. It says well-being, a flourishing human being has some, quite a lot of PERMA. I wonder what I should be pointing this at. So the question is then, how do we measure PERMA? And what psychologists have done for 100 years is to give questionnaires. So if I ask you, Hans, how happy are you right now on a 1 to 10 scale? 7. Well, the problem about the question is it's obtrusive and it's reactive. People lie, they reputation management, they misrepresent, and surveys don't work very well, as we found out in November in the American election. So I've been very interested in measuring PERMA, not by asking people how much P they are and the like, but rather looking at the social media. So it turns out that PERMA has a lexicon. So in English, there are 50,000 words and phrases, which are PERMA and anti-PERMA words and phrases. So we now scan through literally tens of millions of tweets and hundreds of thousands of Facebook statuses measuring the deployment of PERMA and anti-PERMA words. And so there's a measurement revolution that's occurred, and I think the age of the questionnaire is coming to an end. So that's the next thing I'll talk about. Then I'm going to ask the Brickman question, can you have more of it than you do right now? And the answer is yes, you can. And the way this has been discovered, basically, was before as some of you know, before I did positive psychology, I worked on misery, and I worked on evaluating drugs and psychotherapy for mental illness. And there's a gold standard for the evaluation of biological and psychological interventions, which is random assignment placebo-controlled testing. And from the Buddha to modern pop psychology, there have been about 200 suggestions about what makes people happy. And so what we routinely do is we manualize these and we give them to groups of people, and we ask the question, do these things really work? And we've only found about 8 or 10 of them that work, and I'll talk about that a bit. But it turns out that they do work. Some of them do. And what I'll do is I'll go through PERMNA, and I'll tell you something about interventions that work, and stuff your grandmother and your Sunday school teacher wouldn't have known, that science of positive psychology. So I'll look at positive emotion and how to increase that. I'll look at engagement and how to have more engagement. I'll look at quite a remarkable discovery about good human relations. So it turns out there's something new under the sun about love and friendship and loyalty. I'll talk about meaning and building meaning in life, and I'll talk a little bit about accomplishment. So all of that stuff is about individuals. So basically, this is the methodology here, is to give these one more thing before I turn to this. As I say, we've only discovered 8 or 10 of these things that really work. The future of interventions in schools, in marriages, in corporations is not things like making a gratitude visit, but rather it's an Adam Smith argument. It's an argument, invisible hand argument, that once you say you value well-being and you're going to measure it, and I'm going to hold you accountable for increasing your husband's PERMA, then people find the local ways of doing it. It's an invisible hand argument. So I think the future of interventions will be local. All 3 occurred at once. So having talked about this in individuals, I'm then going to ask the question, can you raise PERMA in groups? Can you raise PERMA in schools? And indeed, this is something we work on. I'm going to talk about massive data sets from Bhutan and Mexico and Peru, in which school kids are given positive education courses. I'll tell you the results of that, both for well-being and, intriguingly, for standardized testing as well. Then I'll talk about a huge study in the United States Army, comprehensive soldier and family fitness. And finally, I'll come back to the political theme and talk about the notion of well-being not only as a plausible aim in your own life, but as a plausible aim for a nation and the planet as a whole. So that's the talk. So before I go on, there's plenty of other stuff here I can talk about. Is there anything else you'd like me to include in what happens in the next hour? Okay. Feel free then. So let me start with what it is for a human being to flourish. Now, I start by putting up a dashboard. I think this is a dashboard of an airplane. Because of the question, if you want to know how well an airplane is doing, there is no one number that tells you how well an airplane is doing. Depends on the mission of the airplane. So if if you want to fly from Oslo to Tromsø as quickly as possible, then RPMs is the gauge you pay attention to. If you want to get there as comfortably as possible, you want to avoid thunderstorms and the like, so the radar really matters. If you want to get there as cheaply as possible, it's the petrol you want to look at. So importantly, human motivation on the positive side of life is much more complicated than airplane. And depending on your goals in life, you might pay attention to P, but not to E, or M and A. And these things are often antagonistic. So the job of positive psychology is not to tell you what, it's not, in my view, prescriptive. Rather, it tells you if you're a hedonist and what you want in life is more pleasure, then positive psychology can tell you how to get it, and we know quite a bit about increasing pleasure. but it can also tell you that pleasure and meaning are very often reciprocally related. So for me, positive psychology is descriptive rather than prescriptive. So as I said, the 5 elements that for me matter in that free people pursue are positive emotion, engagement, good relationships, meaning, and accomplishment. So that's the theory that I'm going to be working under, and I'll pause now for objections, questions, comments, and the like. I'm going to do this, I'm going to have not just one question period, but several. So one is the framework. Yeah, all the way in back.
I always wondered, where is physical well-being in your PERMA model?
I couldn't hear you. I lip read. I'm hard of hearing and I lip read.
Okay. So, it's about physical well-being.
Yes, health.
Health.
Good. Yes,
Sex.
One of the main controversies in positive psychology is whether or not there should be an H, and whether or not we pursue physical health in and of itself. And the answer is I'm not convinced yet, but there are FIRMA people who argue that health should be a 6th element. Having good physical health supports all the others in some ways, and that's one of the, so I'd like these things to be exclusive and exhaustive, and that's one of the reasons I've resisted H. But that's not to say I'm very interested in H. The question of being an element is molecules versus elements, so it's kind of an airy academic issue what the elements are. But H is something that positive psychologists are certainly interested in, whether or not it's a basic element. Yes, Hans?
One question, I think I'll just shout it out here. Many of us know PERMA already. Many have studied it, discussed it, written essays even about it, and so on. So if you could go into a bit of a discussion or examples of where it becomes difficult, or where you see the narrows in the framework, where it's most important to put the emphasis in the coming years. That would be interesting also. Maybe I'm jumping a bit ahead in the lecture. I know you have studies to support this, but it's just to tell you that many people are familiar with the framework, are interested in what's the state of the art in this?
I don't think I have too much more good stuff to say about that question. So there is a dispute about whether or not one of these things is the master element, and I'm agnostic about that. There's the question of whether or not there are 2 candidates for addition. There's H for health and R for responsibility. So people have argued that responsibility is yet another one. I don't think I've got too much more interesting, worth your time to say about that. But it may come up when we talk politics a little more. Importantly, as I said 30 years ago, this was all nonsense because these things were not measurable and they weren't buildable. So now they're measurable. And the way we measure them, typically, I have a website in English called AuthenticHappiness.org. 4.5 million people have registered at the website, have taken the tests. How many of you have been to the website? Okay, so you know this website well. And it's got, because so many people have been there, if you want to find out where your sense of humor stands relative to females in Europe, you can pretty much find out that kind of thing from the website. So these are, on this website, there are the 20 questionnaires for PER, M&A, and a few other things. But I've expressed my skepticism about questionnaires, obtrusive, reactive, small samples, expensive, and the like. About 7 years ago, I found myself keynoting a meeting at Google. And I told Larry Page, the CEO, that I wanted to measure the well-being of the world in real time and for free. And that I thought I could do it if I got together with the Google Earth people. That by looking at search engine tweets, Facebook statuses, and quantifying the 50,000 words and phrases that are perma and anti-perma words and phrases, I thought I could get unobtrusive, non-reactive measures of well-being. And indeed, this is what we've been doing for a long time now. And let me just give you a sample of what big data can do that questionnaires can't do. Who do I point this at?
You have to point here. Yeah.
Okay, so this is 40,000 women. And their Facebook statuses. This is a statistical slide as well. So a couple of things. The larger the word, the more it distinguishes women from men. So women say shopping, excited, love you, so, boyfriend, and the like. And the color of the word is about the absolute frequency. So the larger the word, the more female it is versus male. The gray words are very interesting. They're low-frequency words and phrases that when you hear them, you know it's a woman. Love you guys, babies, adorable, baking. Those are female markers. And this is very interesting to me because what I've always wanted to do as a psychologist was kind of peer into the head and see what people were really thinking. And this comes a lot closer than questionnaires. Questionnaires, you tell them what words to think, and they endorse whether or not they do them. So that's 40,000 women. Pointing the wrong way. This is 40,000 men. This is what the guys are thinking. Fuck, Xbox, of death, wishes, and the like. You can not only do men versus women, and by the way, these are almost fingerprints. So if you don't know anything about the person except their tweets or Facebooks, all you have to do is look at this, and with 92% accuracy, you can know if it's a man or a woman. And that's about the limit of accuracy for gender differences anyway. We do it by age, so each of these is about 10,000. So these are kids. So again, the larger the word, the more it distinguishes 13 to 18-year-olds from any other age group. So they're saying school, tomorrow, homework, and the like. This is young adults at work, beer, wedding, days off, drinks. This is the middle-aged among Americans and Brits. And importantly, with big data, you can organize it into topics. So there's a way, a priori, of just looking at statistical relationships to derive topics. And so this is what middle-aged people are tweeting and Facebooking about. Family, friends, wonderful, son, daughter, God, prayers, country, freedom. These are American data. I'm very interested in personality. The question is really, what's the ground truth here? So this is 80,000 people who have taken the big five and told us if they're neurotic or non-neurotic. I've never been very happy about that distinction. And this, importantly, is the word clouds for them. So neurotic people are saying sick of, depressed, lonely, crap, hate. And non-neurotic people are saying, basketball, volleyball, success, and the like. I'm not preaching here, but this is a portrait of neurotic versus non-neurotic people, and I think it's closer to ground truth than questionnaires. Here we go. So I've been interested for many years in death and the prediction of mortality and morbidity from psychological variables. So what you have on the left here is the eastern United States county by county, and it's the death rate from cardiovascular disease. So you can see that if you live on Long Island, it's very high per capita death rate from cardiovascular disease. If you live in the woods of North Carolina, very low death rate. So we wanted to know if you could predict death rate from Twitter. So what we did is we took 80 million tweets from 1,300 counties across the United States, and we asked the question, could you build a model that predicted death rate? And that's on the right. And so you can see that there are almost perfect correlations here, that what the young kids are tweeting about predicts death rate from heart disease in people my age. And it not only predicts it astonishingly strongly, but we've also built a model of the 10 leading risk factors, county by county, for cardiovascular death: obesity, race, education, amount of money spent on health care, and the like. And Twitter outpredicts the 10 leading risk factors taken together. This is what it looks like. So this is what counties that have very high death rate are tweeting about. Fuck, hate, bored, annoying, sluts, and the like. Again, the larger the word, the more it predicts high heart rate relative to high heart rate death. And this is what the counties that are low in heart rate look like, and low in cardiovascular death. Great, folks, interesting conference, thanks, and the like. Again, I'm not preaching here, but these are big effects. I should mention that I think this is more than just a correlation. So these data are, of course, correlational. You know, saying thanks a lot correlates. Young kids say that on Twitter, low cardiovascular death rate. But I actually think it's causal, that the words that go through your head, and that's what makes this so interesting to me, does things to your heart. So there are people who are very interested in vagal tone and the relationship of the psychology to vagal tone. These are the kind of thoughts and words that give you parasympathetic vagal activity, whereas the other ones are sympathetic and block vagal activity. So I actually think this is more than just a correlation. I think it's a theory of psychosomatic death. But I'll leave that for another time. So the upshot, I've done this for Trump and Clinton. These are not very illuminating, but basically I'm interested in political elections, so we basically create word clouds for all the candidates and try to predict elections. We failed this year. The big words for Hillary Clinton, okay, I'll go to Trump. The big word, the larger the word, the more it distinguishes Trump in this case from the 16 other Republican candidates. This was done during the campaign. This is what distinguished Clinton from Sanders, basically. Be that as it may, I guess I can say one thing more about that. Contrary to what the press reported about Trump and Clinton, Trump was really quite optimistic. Clinton was very optimistic by my usual measures, but Trump was also optimistic as well. But the difference was that Trump was very dark, that Trump mentioned more bad events than any presidential candidate since William Jennings Bryan in 1896. So it's a very dark, optimistic candidate. It's what we had, but we predicted that Clinton would win from the difference in optimism, as did everyone else. So that's measurement. So let me summarize what I've said. I've suggested that measurement is terrifically important in positive psychology because what you do in public policy and education and in life follows from what you measure. And I've suggested there are questionnaire measurements of PERMA and big data measurements of PERMA. So let me pause here for comments and questions about measurement. Yeah.
How do you think it affects the social media when people often shows only the happy side on the social media?
Could you hear the question was, in the social media there's pressure to say happy things. I think that's what you're saying. So doesn't that distort all this? And I think the answer is, it's true that there's pressure to say happy things and that people say it more. So that tells you that at any given time, it's unilluminating. But I'm interested in time changes. So when individuals or counties or nations change in time in PERMA and anti-PERMA words, that takes into account the baseline bullshit about sounding happy, and then modulating it up and down is what's of interest to me. Yes, Catherine, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Marty. I went to your MAP program at University of Pennsylvania as the first news journalist in the world, and we're taking positive psychology into how journalism is methodology with growing success.
Catherine is too modest. She's the leading positive journalist in the world.
Thank you, Marty. So I was interested in your dark optimism of Trump. What is dark optimism? Because I know that you did this big study where you were concluding that the positive candidate almost always win.
Right. So if you look at what we did, that's actually, we did something different. We combined rumination and optimism, which was a combination of the number of bad events you talked about and then how optimistic you were about bad events generally, and then the converse for good events, the number of good events you talked about, and then how optimistic you were about good events. So on overall optimism, Clinton was very high and Trump was pretty high. He was higher than all the other Republican candidates. But the big difference was rumination, where rumination is strictly a count of the number of bad events. So Clinton didn't talk about that many bad events. Trump, there's a huge litany of bad events, more than any presidential candidate measured since we started measuring.
Listen, Gibson, a technical question. Do you use a speech recognition program, or how did you collect the data, please?
You know, we haven't done speech recognition, although I'm quite interested both in Instagram facial stuff and this, and also speech. So if you're interested in depression, for example, not enough just to do the words, but you want to count the size and the like. So but no one's really done that yet. So all we do is we take verbatim transcripts, and there are now ways of essentially doing large amounts of verbatim transcripts. But the future of this will be speech, faces, and the like. So one wants to measure PERMA by convergence of words, speech, and sort of non-word speech, and facial stuff. Okay, so where we are then is PERMA is measurable, and that's a necessary condition of any public policy judgment. So if you think we should judge public policy by increasing the PERMA in the world, you really have to have measures, and they have to be better than questionnaire measures by and large. Just technically, since you asked a technical question, we're very interested in combining subjective measures with objective measures to produce superordinate latent variables to measure PERMA as well. So the second part is, can you have more than you do now? And so this comes from individuals, and the methodology for this generally, it starts, so when someone has a idea about what increases happiness, I'm a depressive and a pessimist, I try it on myself, and if it works on me, then I give it to my wife and 7 children. If it works on them, I give it to graduate students and postdocs, and they do in the flesh stuff. And then if it works there, then we take it to the web for disseminating reasons. And if you go to the website, AuthenticHappiness.org, every so often I put up a link called exercises. And it says, Dr. Seligman wants to know what really works and what's a placebo. What really makes people happier? And if you do this, you're going to get an exercise to do for a week, and you won't know if it's placebo or putatively real. And then we're going to bug you for 6 months, measuring happiness, depression, life satisfaction, and the like. So that's the methodology that I'm talking about. Essentially, random assignment, placebo-controlled methodology on large samples. Real advantages over the way drugs and psychotherapy is tested, in fact, methodologically. So let me go through a few of these. Every night for the next week, before you go to sleep, write down 3 things that went well today and why they went well. They don't have to be big things. They could be like a beautiful sunset. It could be making a small slam in bridge, going to a good lecture, and the like. And so we have people do that, and 6 months, and you just do it for a week, but 6 months later, statistically, when you do that, people on average have a higher life satisfaction and lower depression. Second thing about this, it's addictive. So the dirty little secret of psychotherapy and drug research is that the way we measure the effect of psychotherapy and drugs is how long it works until it melts back to 0 after therapy is over. And I mean, dieting is a tip. So dieting is a scam. You probably know this. In America, it's a $50 billion a year scam. And the reason it's a scam is you can lose 5% of your body weight by any diet that's on the bestseller list. I did the watermelon diet. I lost 20 pounds in 3 weeks. I had diarrhea for 3 weeks. But the problem about the watermelon diet and every diet that's known is that between 85 and 95% of people regain all that weight or more over the next 3 to 5 years. And essentially it's because you're fighting a biological system that says, I've been starved and I'm not going to let that happen again. And it's just no fun to keep turning down chocolate mousse. But the nice thing about the positive exercises is they're sticky. You keep doing them after you're supposed to. So I don't write them down anymore, but 15 years later, before I go to sleep now, I think of the good things that happened during the day. And that's different from what we usually do before we go to sleep, which is to brood and to think about the bad stuff that happened during the day. You sleep better, you don't have as many nightmares, and it turns out it's fun to do, so you keep doing it. So it's effective, moderately effective statistically, and it's sticky. Engagement. So Csikszentmihalyi and I have been interested in under what circumstances do we go into flow? And one of them is when you use your signature strengths to do stuff that's difficult, that's challenging. How many of you have taken the signature strengths test? Okay, so close your eyes. Think of something you have to do at least once a week at work that you don't like doing. Okay, open your eyes. So the assignment here is to recraft that task to do it using your highest strength. So one of my students was a waitress, and she didn't like carrying heavy trays. She didn't like being patronized by customers. And so her job was to recraft waitressing using her highest strength. So her highest strength was social intelligence. So she decided to make the encounter with her the social highlight of every customer's evening. And importantly, she failed at that. That is, she wasn't the social highlight of every customer's evening, but she took what was best inside of her and put it on offer. And trays got lighter, and she enjoyed waitressing more, and tips got bigger. So in general, we find that when people recraft stuff they don't like doing, using their highest strength, 6 months later, depression is lower and life satisfaction is higher. Relationships. How many of you are marriage counselors or sex counselors? Not too many of you. Well, that's good. This is the hardest and worst kind of therapy to do. People are lying to you. They're lying to each other. Sometimes they form an alliance against you, and then it goes a little better. But by and large, sex and marital counseling is very difficult. And the reason it's, well, so I've used to teach it. So when I teach graduate students about sex and marriage, you essentially try to teach couples to fight better. So you don't want them to have the same damn fight every day. So you teach them to fight more constructively. So you're basically trying to change insufferable marriages into barely tolerable marriages. You know, that's not a very positive psychology thing to do. So about 10 years ago, a group of California positive marriage counselors said, let's not look at how couples fight, but let's look at how they celebrate. So the question here is, what do you say to your spouse when she comes home from work and she's been promoted? Now, that breaks into a 2-by-2 table, and what most of us, what I certainly did before reading this literature, was passive constructive. Congratulations, dear, you deserve the promotion. It has no effect on anything. It's wallpaper. I've now trained more than 30,000 drill sergeants, the United States Army. Drill sergeants are as you imagine them to be. These are really tough people. And when their wife comes home from work and has been promoted, they say, you know what tax bracket that's going to put us into? And that's a relationship killer. Passive destructive is, what's for dinner? So the only thing that works, and it does not come naturally, so people are now trained to do this, is active constructive. So in active constructive, takes a lot more time, and you're trying to get your spouse to relive and re-experience the good event. And we're such a modest culture, humility counts for so much, that we spend a lot of our time reliving the bad stuff, but we don't relive the good stuff as often as we should. So she's been promoted, and you say, I read the report you wrote about the pension plan, and that's the best fiscal document I've seen in my 25 years in business. Now, exactly where were you when your boss told you you had been promoted? And she tells you. Now, exactly what did he say? What were his words? And she gives you a verbatim as best she can remember it. Now, what do you think the real reasons you were promoted were? What is strengths that you have at work that got you promoted? And she tells you. And can you give examples of how you use those strengths? And how can you use them more with the kids and at church? And let's open a bottle of champagne. And when you do that, sexuality gets better, love and commitment go up, and divorce rate goes down. You can all see this is something usable far beyond marriage and sex. It's about friendship and loyalty and the like. So that's active constructive. M, meaning. Belonging to and serving something bigger than you are. So I assign my students to do something altruistic or to do something fun, essentially to do P or to do M. And something really quite remarkable occurs that most of you at your age know about and in your profession, but kids don't know about this. And here's what happens. One of my students, it was during midterm week, and her nephew called her on the phone, 8 years old, and needed to be tutored in fractions. So she spent 2 hours on the phone tutoring him in fractions. And she said, after that, the whole day went better for me. I was mellow. People liked me, and I could listen to people. When you do something fun, like hang out with your friends or go shopping or masturbate, it has a square wave offset. When it's over, it's over. But when you do something altruistic, it turns out it lasts and lasts. So one of my business students said, I'm in business school because I want to make a lot of money. And I want to make a lot of money because money brings control, it brings security, and it brings happiness. But I was astonished to find out that I was happier helping another person than I was shopping. And it turns out that's generally true, and illuminating experience for people. The way we're wired up as a species is that being altruistic feeds directly into our hedonic system, and powerfully so. I'm often asked by depressed people, what one thing, can you tell me one thing to do that'll make me feel better? 10% of you are probably depressed right now, judging from Scandinavian statistics. The one thing to do if you want to feel better is go outside, find someone who needs help, and help them. It turns out that's the single quickest, doesn't last forever, antidepressant exercise that I know. And the final part of PERMA is accomplishment, and I'm not going to talk about that much. It's work that Angela Duckworth, my colleague and student, has done. We're basically interested in the extent to which self-discipline, grit, accounts for success in various endeavors versus talent. And so in a typical study of Angela's, she measured, do you have spelling bees in Scandinavia and Denmark? Spelling bees are these things that 1 million kids in the United States enter, and they give you very difficult words to spell. And the last 164 kids get invited to Washington, and then there's a big spell-off, and 4 kids wind up winning, 1 kid winds up winning. So Angela measured the IQ of the 168 finalists and the self-discipline of the 168 finalists 2 years in a row, and it's self-discipline that predicts the four finalists and not IQ. Generally, at West Point, in college, and in competitive high schools, we find that self-discipline accounts for about twice as much of the variance as talent. So that's the thrust of Angela's work. So finally I mentioned the invisible hand argument. So the invisible hand says we value PERMA. We're going to measure, let's talk about your marriage. Your assignment in the next month is to increase the PERMA of your husband. Okay? And the way we're going to do it is we're going to measure his PERMA now, and we're going to measure it a month from now. And your job is to increase it. So it turns out when you become accountable for increasing PERMA in the same way we hold managers accountable for increasing productivity, people find ways of increasing PERMA, and it's not by making gratitude visits. In general, I think once you start measuring something and saying you value it, people find all sorts of local ways of increasing it. That's essentially the invisible hand argument. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about building PERMA. And so let me ask for comments or questions about increasing well-being.
What about social status? What about being a victim for bad parenting and stuff like that?
Good question, Christian. I think childhood is overrated. Coming out of Freud and coming out of a mythology about imprinting in childhood, we've come to believe in many ways that what happens to you in childhood determines or has a huge effect on adult personality. The evidence really is against that. So, I mean, that's what I thought, and that's why I went into psychology. But when you control for genetics, so when you take 8,000 twin pairs from the Virginia twin study, and you've got half of them are identical twins and half of them are fraternal twins, and you look, for example, at adult depression, and ask the question, you've got measures of childhood experience, childhood sexual abuse, for example, and you've got measures of recent bad events and the like. It turns out the childhood experiences are small relative to the genetics and relative to recent bad events. So this isn't to make a general comment about positive psychology, but I think we outgrow our childhood, and that in many ways we're born yesterday. And in fact, this belief about childhood determination has itself been one of the perpetuators of the belief in determination of childhood. So I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic that adults change. So I wrote a book about this called What You Can Change and What You Can't. And it's kind of, I tried to review the evidence we had on childhood effects on adult psychopathology and the effects of each of the drugs and psychotherapy on those conditions. And I went away from this essentially unimpressed by childhood. One thing more about childhood. I'm really impressed by adolescence, but not impressed by early childhood. So I think what happens to you ages 2 to 5 are about survival things. And what happens to you starting at age 10 are about the stuff that really matters in wealthy nations, which is marriage, sexuality, and job. So in general, I'm very supportive of adolescent interventions, and I think we've been wasting a lot of money on childhood. That's, sorry, uncongenial, I'm sure, but that's what I believe about it.
I have one question for you, Marty. It's maybe the most often asked questions of all when we talk about building PERMA or increasing well-being, and that is how the aim of increasing well-being for individuals blocks changes, structural changes in society. So if we try to improve PERMA or improve well-being in people, is that really covering up the necessity of changing structures? That is probably the most often cited debate here on that.
Yeah, that's really an important question, and it's actually an empirical question. It's the data on wealth and life satisfaction that interests me most about this. So a lot of our social engineering aims are about increasing wealth in one form or another. And I'm all for increasing wealth, and I'm all for a huge safety net socially. But the question is, once you've already got a great safety net, like Denmark has, for example, what is the effect of increasing wealth on human well-being? And that turns out to be really quite disappointing. So we know pretty well the relationship of wealth to life satisfaction, both within nations and between nations. And it's powerfully curvilinear. And basically, it looks like this, that below the safety net, what you want to do is increase the safety net, wealth, benefits, and the like. But once you get, in looking at the United States data, above about $120,000 a year for a family, increases in wealth don't produce much in the way of increases in life satisfaction and well-being. Now, the upshot of that for you as individuals is that if you're making a million kroner a year, and you're thinking about giving up 3 weekends next year to make another 200,000 kroner, and what you care about is how happy you're going to be next year, you probably shouldn't do it. That if you spend those 3 weekends with families and friends or at leisure, you'll probably get more than the extra 200,000 kroner would be. That's the individual message. The message for nations is that the obsession with increasing GDP forever is probably really a mistake. That at some point, the best way of, once you've got a wealthy nation, Scandinavia, the United States, increases in GDP don't increase well-being as much as other things, better relationships, more meaning in life, and the like. So I think that's basically my view. So just to summarize it, in the conditions of poverty, social engineering is very important, needs to be done, increasing wealth. But for this audience and for Denmark and the people you work with, you've already got a great safety net in place. And that's why I think well-being now becomes the measure. And that's not a function of economics in the situation you're in. So that's my view of the data. So we talked about, let me just see what time it is. I don't want to keep you here forever. What time are we supposed to end, by the way? 5 o'clock, okay. So we talked about individual well-being. So the question now is, can you increase well-being in larger organizations? So we go to schools, and we have well-being curricula, which essentially take the kinds of exercises we were talking about and repackages them for kids of the appropriate age and the like. Alejandro Adler is the leading researcher in the world on this. So Alejandro began by going to Bhutan. We went to Bhutan because we wanted to work in an environment that was friendly to well-being. So as you probably know, the former king of Bhutan has advocated gross national happiness as opposed to GDP. And so the Minister of Education was very excited to work with us. They began by giving us 18 schools involving about 7,000 kids. So we went to those schools. Alejandro, the language is English, so we're able to do it in English. And the teachers go on in the 11 experimental, they go on a retreat for a week with Alejandro, and this is important. When we teach well-being and resilience, we first teach the teachers how to have more of it in their own life, and then we teach how to teach it. And people get to see, hey, this really works in my life. So Alejandro developed this curriculum. There are retreats in the control group as well. In the control group, we teach nutrition, we teach psychology, but not psychology of well-being. And then came back 15 months later and 2 years later and measured well-being, and importantly, the well-being in the schools of the people who had the well-being curriculum was higher. But most importantly, and this is the Minister of Education argument, when we go to ministers of education or to superintendents of schools and we say, we want to teach kids to be happier, they say, well, what are you going to cut out? School is a zero-sum game. You're going to cut out physics, you're going to cut out music, making kids happier is not going to make them, the goal of school is not happiness. The goal of school is literacy and numeracy and science. So very important was the question is what happens to literacy, numeracy, and science? So Bhutan gives yearly national science, literature, math, standardized exams, and importantly, the kids the schools that have had the well-being curriculum, the students are about, these are big effects, about half a year ahead of the students in the control groups. So now Bhutan has adopted this for all the schools in Bhutan. So Alejandro then went to his native country of Mexico, and Jalisco, the governor of Jalisco, wanted to do the same thing, so he gave Alejandro 70 schools, I think, involving 68,000 children. And they did the same thing. The program is translated into Spanish and is culturally appropriate. And again, Alejandro found that 15 months later, the kids are happier. And most importantly, the standardized tests are higher. So then Alejandro and the World Bank went to Peru with almost 700,000 students and did the same thing, and again with the same results. You'll notice that even though there's highly significant differences in standardized test scores. They get smaller. And that's because there are more layers of training of trainers. So when we did Bhutan, I could use my faculty to train the teachers directly. In Mexico, we trained trainers of trainers, and then the trainers of trainers trained. And in Peru, there were 3 levels, so it gets more and more dilute, but the effects are still quite detectable. United States Army, about 10 years ago, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army called me to the Pentagon, and he said, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, divorce, panic, drug abuse. What does positive psychology say about that, Dr. Seligman? And I said, sir, you've just described how many soldiers have their lives ruined by combat. But it's important to know about awful things that happen in life, like combat, that the human reaction is statistically bell-shaped. And you've described the stuff on the left-hand side of the bell, people who have their lives destroyed by combat. But interestingly, in the middle, you've got what's called resilience. And resilience means technically that these are people who have a tough time in combat, but 3 months later, they're back where they were both physically and psychologically. And that's the average soldier response. And then importantly, on the right-hand side of the bell curve, little known is post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth, these are soldiers who often have a terrible time in combat and come very close to PTSD, but a year later, they're stronger both physically and psychologically than they were. And so my recommendation, sir, to General Casey was to try to move the whole population toward post-traumatic growth. And a couple of remarkable things happened before my eyes. And so, Klaus, unlike what you do when you have a good idea as a dean, you try to convince your colleagues to implement it. General Casey ordered that from that day forward, positive psychology and resilience would be taught throughout the entire United States Army, and he would create an army that was as psychologically fit as physically fit, and he allocated $140 million to it. And then he said, we've read what you do in schools, and we see that you teach teachers the skills of resilience and positive psychology. They teach the students, and you measure the students. Well, we have 40,000 teachers in the United States Army. I said, really? He said, yeah, the drill sergeants. So your job, Dr. Seligman, will be to teach all the drill sergeants in the United States Army resilience and positive psychology. They will teach the soldiers, and then we will measure PTSD, drug abuse, and the like. So for the last 7 years, every month 180 drill sergeants come to the University of Pennsylvania, and they're trained by the faculty, and then they train the soldiers. And it's now very hard to test the effects because it turned out to be an enormously popular program, and they rolled it out right away, so we didn't have too much in the way of control groups. But when we did, what this slide shows on a group of about 7,000 soldiers was that training in positive psychology halves the rate of substance abuse and significantly decreases the rate of PTSD, panic, and depression. But just to give you a feel for what's really going on here, when drill sergeants first arrive at the University of Pennsylvania, and they're sitting in a room like this, and we're talking about they're sitting there like this. They're thinking, what is this feminine psychobabble, emasculating stuff that's going to ruin the United States Army? Then by the end of the first hour, they're leaning forward, and by the end of the 8th day, half of them say it's the best course they ever had in the Army. Emblematic is, let's see how to say this. PTSD and suicide in the United States Army, as best we can tell, is not about combat. but it's the wars that the United States has found itself in the last 20 years, the first wars in which there have been cell phones. And so a typical PTSD or suicide will phone his girlfriend in Kansas City before going into combat, and she doesn't answer the phone, and she thinks she's having an affair. And it turns out these are over the same kinds of things that Danish suicides and PTSD are about. But emblematic of this is, so we teach active constructive responding. So one morning I came to breakfast after teaching active constructive responding, and one of the drill sergeants said to me that at 9 the previous night he phoned his son, and his son had hit a home run in Little League and won the game. And after 5 minutes, his son said, "Is this really you, Daddy?" Which is to say, what's learned in this are a set of resilient social skills that serve the soldiers very well in life. So I'm going to conclude now by returning to politics. So let's see. What I've said substantively is that well-being is measurable and it's buildable. It's buildable not only in individuals, it's buildable in corporations, in large groups, and I think in schools and in nations as a whole. So that leads me to want to say that well-being, the reason money is interesting, GDP and unemployment are interesting, the reason we care about them is they're approximations of human well-being. And there was a time at which they were good approximations, but GDP is no longer a good approximation of well-being for several reasons. One, every time there's a suicide in Denmark, GDP goes up. GDP is just a measure of utilization of goods and services. Every time there's an automobile accident in Denmark, GDP goes up. These are called regretables by economists. If you pay a babysitter, that's part of GDP. But if you take care of your children yourself, that's not part of GDP. There's an enormous gray area about human endeavors. So this leads me to believe that the reason we care about the economic variables is they approximate well-being, but now we can measure well-being. So I want to say that well-being as an end becomes a politically viable end in itself, now that we can measure it. As all of you know, Denmark consistently is the highest country on subjective well-being. Interestingly, no one has yet measured PERMA in Denmark. So subjective well-being is how much life satisfaction do you have. That's different from how much meaning do you have in life. And so I'm looking forward to the measurement of PERMA in Denmark to see if it holds up. But what happens when nations are wealthy? Denmark, the United States, and the like. Well, for most of human history has occurred in times of shortage, plague, war, civil discontent, and the like. What happens when you're not at war, and when you're wealthy, and when you're not in civil strife? So Florence of the 15th century is one of the few great examples we have. So, as you know, around 1460, Florence became tremendously wealthy, due largely to Medici banking genius. And under Cosimo the Elder, the leading people in the city said, "Hey, what are we going to do with this huge surplus?" And the generals said, "Oh, let's go conquer the peninsula." But what Cosimo the Elder won and said, he gave us what was called the Renaissance 200 years later. He said, let's devote our wealth to beauty and to science. Now, I believe that Denmark, the EU, the United States, the wealthy nations of the world are at a Florentine moment. And I'm not suggesting what we should do with our surplus is to do beauty, but rather I'm suggesting that we should do well-being. That the building of human well-being is what this is all about. And so for me, economics is in the service of psychology. It's measurable and it's buildable. But I told you at the outset that this was half a political speech. So the half I've given is that we should measure well-being, build it, and that we should evaluate government by its success in well-being. But the half I haven't talked about is something I just can't penetrate, and it's the question of the moral circle. So whose well-being are we talking about? Well, unfortunately, the human species is extremely tribal. And we're more concerned with well-being of people who look like us than we are of well-being in the world. Now, for me, we don't know how to break down tribalism. So the half of the political message that I can't speak to is increasing the diameter of the moral circle. But I'd suggest to you that the future of our politics, a future that I look forward to, combines two things. One is increasing the size of the moral circle, but secondly, the measurement and building of human well-being. Thank you.